The gunshots had long faded into the distance when Harriet Cole spotted the abandoned cabin at the edge of the plains, a mirage shimmering in the Nevada heat. Beside her, Hannah Campbell clutched a tattered shawl around her shoulders, her face streaked with dust and tears. Both women had lost everything in the raid husbands' homes, and hope leaving them to wander the unforgiving terrain with nothing but grief for company. "I can't go another step," Hannah whispered, her voice cracking with exhaustion. At 32, she was 5 years younger than Harriet, though the past week had aged them both beyond measure. Harriet squinted at the horizon, where the sun blazed a brutal orange against the darkening sky. "Just a little further. We can rest at that cabin, then make for Pahrump tomorrow." They trudged forward, their boots kicking up dust from the parched earth. The spring of 1879 had been uncharacteristically dry, even for Nevada territory. The cabin grew closer with each painful step, and as they approached, Harriet could see it was more dilapidated than she'd initially thought. Half-collapsed roof, broken windows, door hanging askew. "No one's lived here for years," Hannah observed, disappointment heavy in her voice. Before Harriet could respond, the distant thunder of hooves drew their attention. A rider approached from the west, silhouetted against the setting sun. Both women tensed, memories of the raid still fresh in their minds. 3 days ago, a band of outlaws had descended upon their small settlement outside Pahrump, killing and burning with no mercy. The Cole and Campbell men had died trying to protect their homes, along with 5 other settlers. "Should we hide?" Hannah whispered, clutching Harriet's arm. Harriet stood her ground, too exhausted to run. "Where would we go? Besides, it's just one rider." As the horseman drew closer, they could make out his features, a man in his mid-30s with a weathered face beneath the shadow of his wide-brimmed hat. His horse, a magnificent chestnut, slowed to a walk as he approached the women. "Evening, ladies," he called, his voice deep but cautious. "Mason Zimmer's the name. You look like you've had a hard journey." Harriet stepped forward slightly. "We have indeed, Mr. Zimmer." "I'm Harriet Cole, and this is Hannah Campbell. Our settlement was raided 3 days ago. We're the only survivors, as far as we know." The cowboy's expression darkened. "The settlement east of Pahrump, I heard about that in town yesterday." He dismounted in one fluid motion, keeping a respectful distance. "I'm sorry for your losses. Were you heading for that cabin?" Hannah nodded weakly. "We need shelter for the night." Mason glanced at the dilapidated structure and shook his head. "That won't do. It's not safe. Roof could come down any minute." He looked back toward the west. "My homestead's about 4 miles that way. It's not much, but I've got a solid roof, food, and a spare room. You ladies are welcome to it." The women exchanged uncertain glances. Taking shelter with a strange man wasn't ideal, but they had few options. "We're grateful for the offer," Harriet finally said, "but we wouldn't want to impose." "No imposition," Mason insisted. "I can't in good conscience leave 2 ladies out here with night coming on. There are wolves in these parts, not to mention the occasional outlaw." The mention of outlaws was enough to sway them. Hannah nodded vigorously, and Harriet reluctantly agreed. "I'll take you both on Thunder here," Mason said, patting his horse's neck. "He's strong enough to carry 3 for a short distance." The journey to Mason's homestead passed in silence, save for the rhythmic hoofbeats and the occasional cry of a distant hawk. Harriet sat in the middle, acutely aware of Mason's chest against her back as he guided the horse. The terrain gradually changed from open plains to scattered pine and juniper, the air growing cooler as they gained elevation. Mason's homestead came into view just as dusk settled over the land, a sturdy log cabin with a stone chimney, a small barn, and a corral where several horses grazed. A stream bubbled nearby, reflecting the last golden rays of sunlight. "It's beautiful," Hannah murmured, the first hint of life returning to her voice. "Been working on it for 5 years now," Mason replied with quiet pride. "Cut every timber myself." He helped them dismount and led them inside while Thunder waited patiently. The cabin's interior was simple but comfortable, a main room with a fireplace, a small kitchen area, a door leading to what must be a bedroom and a ladder up to a loft. "You ladies can take my room," Mason said, gesturing to the door. "I'll sleep in the loft. Let me just tend to thunder and bring in some more firewood." Once he'd gone outside, Hannah collapsed onto a chair by the hearth. "Do you think we can trust him?" she whispered. Harriet considered the question carefully. "I think so. He could have harmed us already if that was his intention." She moved to the small window, watching as Mason unsaddled his horse with gentle, practiced movements. "Besides, we need help right now. We can decide our next steps in the morning." By the time Mason returned with an armload of firewood, Harriet had found coffee beans and a pot. "May I?" she asked, holding them up. "Please, make yourselves at home," he replied, stacking the wood by the fireplace. "I'm afraid I don't have much to offer in the way of comforts, living out here alone." "You're not married?" Hannah asked, then blushed at her directness. A shadow passed over Mason's face. "I was. Lost my wife and son to fever 3 years ago. They're buried on the hill behind the cabin." The confession hung heavy in the air, a shared understanding passing between the 3 survivors. Without another word, Mason set about lighting the fire while Harriet prepared coffee and Hannah found some salted beef and biscuits in Mason's cupboard. They ate a simple meal together, the food tasting better than anything the women had experienced since fleeing their burning homes. As the evening wore on, they shared their stories in halting sentences and long pauses. "James and I had been married 15 years, Harriet said, staring into her coffee cup. "We came west from Missouri after the war looking for a fresh start. He was a good man, quiet but kind." "Thomas was a dreamer," Hannah added, tears welling in her eyes. "Always talking about the cattle ranch we would build someday. We only had a few head, but he treated them like they were prized stock." Mason listened intently, asking few questions but offering the comfort of his attention. When the women finally retired to his bedroom, exhaustion overtook them immediately, and they fell into dreamless sleep on his sturdy bed with its handmade quilt. The morning brought a new clarity, the horrors of the past days temporarily held at bay by the simple routines of life. Harriet woke first, slipping quietly from the bed to avoid disturbing Hannah. She found Mason outside, already hard at work chopping wood. "Good morning," she called, wrapping a borrowed blanket around her shoulders against the dawn chill. Mason paused, wiping his brow. "Morning, Mrs. Cole." "Hope you slept well." "Better than I have in days," she admitted. "And please call me Harriet. May I help with breakfast?" He nodded, setting aside his axe. "I'd appreciate that. I'm no great cook, I'm afraid." As they worked side by side in his small kitchen, Harriet found herself studying Mason from the corner of her eye. He moved with a quiet efficiency, his hands strong but gentle as he handled cups and plates. There was a sadness about him that mirrored her own, yet he carried it with dignity. Hannah joined them as the bacon sizzled in the pan, her face less drawn after a night of proper rest. "Something smells wonderful," she said, attempting a smile. Over breakfast, Mason broached the subject they'd all been avoiding. "What are your plans now, if you don't mind my asking?" The women exchanged glances. "We need to get to Pahrump," Harriet said finally. "Report the raid to the sheriff, though I doubt they'll catch those men now. After that." She trailed off, the future a vast emptiness before her. "We have nothing left," Hannah said bluntly. "No husbands, no home, no money," Mason nodded thoughtfully. "I can take you to town today, but you're welcome to stay here while you figure things out. I have the space, and to be honest, I could use the help around the place." The offer hung in the air, unexpected and generous. Harriet studied Mason's face, searching for hidden motives but finding only sincerity. "That's very kind," she said carefully, "but we couldn't impose on you indefinitely." "It's no imposition," he insisted. "The truth is, this land gets lonely. Having people around again would be welcome." Hannah looked relieved, but Harriet remained cautious. "We'll stay a few days, at least until we can contact my sister in California. She might be able to help us." Mason seemed satisfied with this arrangement. After breakfast, he hitched his wagon for the journey into Pahrump. The ride took most of the morning. the rough terrain slowing their progress. As they approached the small frontier town, Harriet felt a mixture of dread and determination. Reporting their husband's murders would make everything horribly real. Pahrump in 1879 was little more than a dusty main street flanked by essential buildings: a general store, saloon, small hotel, and the sheriff's office. Mason helped the women down from the wagon and escorted them to Sheriff Taylor, a grizzled man with kind eyes who listened gravely to their account of the raid. "I'm mighty sorry, ladies," he said when they'd finished. "I sent a deputy out that way when we first heard, but there wasn't much left to find. No survivors, we thought." He made some notes in a ledger. "Any idea who these men were?" Harriet shook her head. "They came at dawn. We barely saw them before we ran." "They had red bandanas," Hannah added suddenly, "all of them covering their faces." The sheriff exchanged a glance with Mason. "Sounds like the Shelton gang. They've been terrorizing settlements across 3 territories. He sighed heavily. "I'll telegraph the territorial marshal, but I won't lie to you, chances of catching them are slim." After leaving the sheriff's office, Mason took them to the general store, insisting on purchasing necessities for them: clothing, toiletries, and other essentials they'd lost. Harriet protested, but he was firm. "Consider it a loan if you must," he said quietly. "You can pay me back when you're on your feet again." Harriet sent a telegram to her sister in Sacramento, briefly explaining their situation and asking for help. Whether that help would come and when remained uncertain. The ride back to Mason's homestead was quieter, each lost in their own thoughts. As the wagon rolled across the plains, Hannah finally broke the silence. "Why are you helping us, Mr. Zimmer?" she asked directly. "Most men would have pointed us toward town and been on their way." Mason kept his eyes on the horizon. "My pa taught me that a man's character is measured by how he treats those in need." He paused, then added softly, "And I know something about loss. No one should face it alone." The days that followed fell into a rhythm of shared work and quiet healing. Mason showed them his small ranch operation: 20 head of cattle, 5 horses, and a large vegetable garden. Harriet took over the cooking, finding comfort in the familiar task, while Hannah revealed a talent for tending the garden. At night, Mason would often sit on his porch, playing soft melodies on a battered harmonica. Sometimes the women joined him, sometimes they retired early, but the music always floated through the cabin like a gentle reminder that beauty still existed in the world. On their 5th day at the homestead, Mason announced at breakfast that he needed to ride out to check his northern fence line. "There's a section that's been troubling me," he explained. "Might take most of the day to repair." "I could come with you," Harriet offered impulsively. "An extra pair of hands might speed the work." Mason seemed surprised but pleased. "I'd appreciate the company. It's about an hour's ride." As they set out, Harriet on a gentle mare named Daisy, she felt a strange lightness she hadn't experienced since before the raid. The day was clear and warm, the landscape vast around them. Mason rode beside her, occasionally pointing out landmarks or sharing bits of knowledge about the land. "See those hills to the east," he said at one point. "There's a natural spring there that never runs dry, even in the worst drought. Saved my cattle more than once." "You know this land well," Harriet observed. "Had to learn it," he replied. "Land out here will kill you if you don't understand its ways." They reached the damaged section of fence before noon. Several posts had been knocked loose, likely by a wandering buffalo or perhaps a stray horse. Mason dismounted and began unloading tools from his saddlebags. "My husband was never very handy," Harriet admitted as she helped. "He could coax crops from the driest soil, but ask him to fix a cabinet and you'd end up with a 3-legged table." Mason chuckled, the sound warming something long cold inside her. "My father was a carpenter before he turned to ranching. Taught me everything he knew. Said a man should be able to build with his hands what he can picture in his mind." They worked side by side, Mason showing Harriet how to properly brace a fence post while he secured it. The physical labor was satisfying, and the conversation flowed more easily than it had at the cabin, where Hannah's presence sometimes created a certain reserve. "Did you always want to be a rancher?" Harriet asked as they paused to drink from Mason's canteen. He shook his head. "Thought I'd be a doctor once, even studied for a year back east, but then the war came and afterward." He shrugged. "The cities felt too crowded, needed space to breathe." "You fought in the war." Harriet had assumed he was too young. "Last year of it. Joined up at 17, saw just enough to know I never wanted to see more." He handed her the canteen. "What about you? Did you always see yourself as a farmer's wife?" The question caught her off guard. "I suppose I never thought much beyond marriage. That's what women did." She took a drink, considering. "But I always loved books, used to dream of opening a little school." "You still could," Mason said, surprising her. "Pahrump has plenty of children with no proper schooling." The suggestion lingered in Harriet's mind as they finished the fence repairs and started the journey back. The sun was beginning its descent, casting long shadows across the plains. They rode in comfortable silence for a while before Mason spoke again. "I'm glad you came today," he said simply. Harriet smiled, realizing it was the first genuine smile she'd managed since the raid. "So am I." When they returned to the cabin, they found Hannah sitting on the porch with a letter in her hand. "The boy from town brought it," she explained. "It's from your sister in California." Harriet quickly read the letter, her expression falling. "She can't help us," she said finally. "Her husband lost his position at the bank and they're struggling themselves." That night, after Hannah had gone to bed, Harriet sat with Mason by the fire, the silence between them comfortable yet charged with unspoken thoughts. "I've been thinking," Mason said eventually, his voice low to avoid waking Hannah in the next room. "I need to expand the cabin anyway. Been meaning to add another room or two." He stared into the flames. "If you both wanted to stay longer, make a proper home here, I could build you your own space." Harriet felt her heart quicken. "That's incredibly generous, but it's selfish too," he interrupted gently. "Having you both here. It's brought life back to this place." His eyes met hers. "I'm not proposing anything improper, Harriet, just offering shelter and friendship for as long as you need it." She studied his face in the firelight, seeing honesty and something else, something that made her look away quickly. "Let me discuss it with Hannah," she said finally. "But, thank you, Mason, truly." The next morning, Harriet broached the subject with Hannah as they collected eggs from Mason's small chicken coop. "He wants to build onto the cabin," Hannah clarified, her eyebrows rising. "For us." "He says he was planning to expand anyway," Harriet explained. "But yes, essentially, he's offering us a permanent place to stay." Hannah was quiet for a moment, carefully placing another egg in her basket. "Do you think he has intentions toward either of us?" The question made Harriet flush. "He said he wasn't proposing anything improper." "That's not what I asked," Hannah said with surprising directness. "I've seen how he looks at you when you're not watching, Harriet." "Don't be ridiculous," Harriet protested, though her heart skipped. "We're both still in mourning." "Grief doesn't stop a heart from beating," Hannah said softly. "And it's been lonely for him out here." Harriet changed the subject, but Hannah's words stayed with her throughout the day. That evening, they gave Mason their answer: they would stay, at least until they could establish themselves elsewhere. His face lit up with a smile that made Harriet's chest tighten inexplicably. The next week passed in a flurry of activity as Mason began preparations for expanding the cabin. He rode into Pahrump to purchase additional supplies, returning with a wagon full of lumber and building materials. Hannah took to sketching possible layouts for the addition, revealing an unexpected talent for design. "We could add 2 rooms on the east side," she suggested one evening, showing Mason her rough plans. "One for each of us with a small shared sitting area." Mason nodded appreciatively. "That's good thinking. The morning sun would warm those rooms nicely in winter." Harriet watched their interaction with a strange mix of emotions. Hannah seemed to be regaining her spirit, the haunted look in her eyes gradually fading. For her part, Harriet found herself increasingly drawn to Mason, his quiet strength. his gentle manner with both women, the way his hands moved confidently whether branding a calf or carefully measuring timber for the cabin extension. Construction began in earnest, with all three working together under Mason's direction. Hannah proved surprisingly adept with a hammer, while Harriet focused on keeping everyone fed and handling the regular ranch chores so Mason could concentrate on building. One evening, about 3 weeks after the women had arrived, Harriet was preparing supper when she heard a crash outside, followed by Hannah's cry of alarm. She rushed out to find Mason on the ground beside a partially framed wall, grimacing in pain. "The beam slipped," Hannah explained frantically as Harriet knelt beside him. "His leg was caught underneath." Mason tried to wave off their concern. "Just bruised, I think," he insisted, though his face was pale. "Let's get you inside," Harriet said firmly. With Hannah's help, they managed to get Mason to his feet and into the cabin where they settled him on his bed. "I need to check your leg," Harriet insisted, her tone brooking no argument. Mason reluctantly agreed, and Hannah tactfully left to prepare a cold compress. As Harriet carefully removed Mason's boot and rolled up his pant leg, she saw an angry red welt forming along his calf, but thankfully no signs of a break. "You're lucky," she told him, gently probing the injury. "A few inches higher and you might have broken something." Mason watched her face as she worked, her fingers cool against his skin. "You have a healer's touch," he said softly. Harriet glanced up, caught in his gaze. "My mother was a midwife. I learned a few things." The moment stretched between them, fragile and electric, until Hannah returned with the compress. Harriet quickly stepped back, her cheeks warm. "You'll need to rest that leg for a day or two," she told Mason briskly. "The building can wait." He looked ready to protest but nodded reluctantly. "Yes, madam." The enforced rest period changed the dynamic between them. With Mason confined to the cabin, the three spent more time in conversation, sharing stories and gradually revealing more of themselves. Harriet learned that Mason had fought for the Union despite being from Virginia, causing a rift with his family that had never fully healed. Hannah spoke of her childhood in Tennessee, where her father had been a preacher with unconventional views on equality that had made him both beloved and controversial. On the second evening of Mason's recovery, Hannah retired early with a headache, leaving Harriet and Mason alone by the fire. A comfortable silence settled between them as Harriet mended a shirt and Mason whittled a small piece of wood. "What are you making?" Harriet finally asked, curious. Mason turned the small carving in his hands. "A horse, I think, or at least it was supposed to be," he grinned ruefully. "Might end up as firewood instead." Harriet set aside her sewing and moved closer to examine his work. "No, I can see it. The shape is there." Their hands brushed as she pointed out the lines of the carving, and neither pulled away immediately. "Harriet," Mason said softly, her name a question in his voice. She met his eyes, seeing vulnerability and hope there. "It's too soon," she whispered, though she didn't move away. "I know," he agreed. "For both of us, but—" He set the carving aside and gently took her hand. "I haven't felt this way in a long time, didn't think I ever would again." Harriet's heart thundered in her chest. "I'm still grieving James." "As I still grieve Elizabeth," Mason acknowledged. "But is it wrong to find comfort in each other, to build something new from the ashes?" Before she could answer, the door to the bedroom opened and Hannah appeared, looking pale. "I'm sorry to interrupt," she said, her eyes taking in their joined hands. "I need some water." The moment broken, Harriet quickly stood and fetched a cup of water for Hannah, who thanked her with a knowing look before returning to bed. The next morning, Mason's leg was much improved, and he insisted on returning to work on the cabin addition. Hannah offered to help him, giving Harriet a pointed look that suggested they needed to talk privately. As they worked together setting posts for the new walls, Hannah broached the subject directly. "You care for him," she stated, handing Mason a nail. He paused, hammer in mid-air. "Is it that obvious?" "To me, yes." Hannah positioned a board carefully. "And she cares for you too, though she's fighting it." Mason drove the nail with perhaps more force than necessary. It feels disloyal somehow, to Elizabeth's memory. Hannah was quiet for a moment. Thomas always said that love wasn't a limited resource, that the heart expands to accommodate more without diminishing what came before. She met Mason's eyes. I think he was right. Mason considered her words. What about you, Hannah? How do you fit into all this? She smiled, a hint of sadness in her expression. I'm going to Pahrump next week. Sheriff Taylor mentioned that the boarding house is looking for help, and I've always been good with numbers and organization. You don't have to leave, Mason protested. I do, she said gently. Not because I'm not grateful, but because I need to find my own way forward. And she gave him a knowing look. Three's a crowd, Mason. Later that evening, Hannah shared her decision with Harriet, who was predictably upset. You can't go to Pahrump alone. We promised to stay together. We promised to survive, Hannah corrected her. And now we both need to find our paths. Mine leads to town and yours. She glanced meaningfully toward the porch where Mason sat playing his harmonica. I don't know what you're implying, Harriet said stiffly. Hannah took her friend's hands. Yes, you do, and it's all right, Harriet. James would want you to be happy. Tears filled Harriet's eyes. It feels like betrayal. It's not betrayal to keep living, Hannah insisted. It's honoring what they gave us the strength to go on, to find joy again. The following week brought Hannah's departure, despite Harriet's continued protests. Mason drove them both into Pahrump, where Hannah was warmly welcomed by Mrs. Donovan, the boarding house proprietor who had known Hannah's husband. You come visit anytime, Hannah told Harriet as they said their goodbyes, and don't be stubborn about what's right in front of you. The ride back to the homestead was quiet, both Mason and Harriet lost in their thoughts. The cabin seemed emptier without Hannah's presence, yet somehow more intimate. They moved around each other carefully that evening, the air between them charged with unspoken possibilities. As summer progressed into early fall, they continued work on the cabin addition, which now seemed excessive for just the two of them. One evening, as they stood surveying their progress, Mason voiced what they'd both been thinking. Perhaps we could make this a proper home office instead, he suggested. If you still dream of teaching, you could start with lessons here. Harriet looked at him in surprise. You remembered that? I remember everything you tell me, Harriet. The simple statement held such sincerity that she had to look away. That night, as they sat on the porch watching the sunset paint the plains in gold and crimson, Mason finally broached the subject they'd been dancing around for weeks. I know it hasn't been long since you lost James, he began carefully, and I would never ask you to forget him or what you shared. Harriet's heart quickened. Mason, please let me finish, he said gently. When I lost Elizabeth and our boy, I thought my heart died with them. I existed, but I wasn't living. Then you and Hannah arrived and something woke up inside me. He turned to face her fully. Especially with you, Harriet, you brought light back into my life. Tears welled in her eyes. I feel the same, she admitted softly, and it terrifies me. Mason reached for her hand, his touch warm and steady. We can take all the time you need. I'm not going anywhere. The first kiss they shared was gentle, hesitant a promise rather than a passion. Yet it kindled something in Harriet that she had thought forever extinguished. As Mason's arms encircled her, she felt not the betrayal she had feared, but a sense of coming home. Fall gave way to winter, bringing snow to the high desert and long evenings by the fire. Mason completed the cabin addition, now transformed into a combination study and schoolroom, where Harriet began teaching 3 children from a neighboring ranch who rode over 3 times a week. Hannah visited for Christmas, bringing news of Parhump's growth and her own blossoming role in the community. She had become Mrs. Donovan's right hand and was helping to organize the town's first proper school board. We'll need a headmistress by spring, she told Harriet with a meaningful look. Someone with a passion for education and a gift for teaching. Harriet glanced at Mason, who smiled encouragingly. It's only a 3-mile ride each way, he said. Easily manageable daily. You wouldn't mind, she asked. His answer was simple. I want you to have your dreams, Harriet. All of them. On New Year's Eve, with Hannah having returned to town, Mason led Harriet to the small hill behind the cabin where his wife and son were buried. He had added 2 more markers, simpler crosses bearing the names James Cole and Thomas Campbell. "I thought they should have a place here," he explained as Harriet stared in shock, "so we can remember them properly." Tears flowed freely down her cheeks as she knelt between the memorials. "Thank you," she whispered. "This means more than I can say." As they walked back to the cabin, snow beginning to fall gently around them, Mason stopped and turned to her. "Harriet, I know we've only known each other a short time, but I'm certain of what I feel." He took her hands in his. "I love you. And if you'll have me, I'd like to make this arrangement permanent." Harriet looked up at him, this man who had offered shelter when she had nothing, who had built her not just a home but a future. "I love you too, Mason," she said, the words feeling right on her lips. "And yes, I'll have you." They were married in the spring of 1880 in Parham's newly built church, with Hannah serving as Harriet's attendant and Sheriff Taylor standing up for Mason. The entire town turned out for the celebration, which many saw as a symbol of renewal after the tragedy that had brought Harriet to their community. As the newlyweds prepared to leave for their homestead, Hannah embraced Harriet tightly. "From such darkness," she whispered, "you found light again." "We both did," Harriet replied, looking at her friend with affection. "Different paths, but both forward." Mason had built a new bedroom onto the cabin as a wedding gift, the walls lined with bookshelves for Harriet's growing collection. As they settled into married life, Harriet divided her time between teaching in Parham and helping Mason with the ranch, which prospered under their joint care. In the summer of 1881, Harriet discovered she was expecting. Mason's joy was tempered with concern, given his past loss, but Harriet's calm confidence steadied him. Hannah visited often during the pregnancy, helping prepare for the baby and sharing the latest town gossip. Their son, James Mason Zimmer, was born on a clear winter morning in February 1882, healthy and strong with his father's eyes and his mother's determined chin. As Harriet held her newborn, with Mason beside her and Hannah beaming from the foot of the bed, she reflected on the journey that had brought them all to this moment. 2 widows had wandered the plains after a raid that took everything from them. A cowboy had built them shelter from his own timber. And from that simple act of kindness had grown a new family, a new beginning, a new love that honored what came before while embracing what lay ahead. As Mason gently took his son into his arms, his face alight with wonder and joy, Harriet knew with absolute certainty that even in the harshest wilderness, hope could take root and flourish. Their story, born of tragedy yet culminating in happiness, was proof that love, like the resilient western landscape itself, could endure, transform, and ultimately triumph.